I am giving you a second chance, I said then calmly, almost magnanimously. If someone had told me then that these words would define our entire life, I might have kept silent. But I was 29, and I considered myself wiser than my own pain. I thought time would smooth the sharp edges, that one day we would remember this as a youthful mistake. I did not know that words spoken with dignity can grow into a silence half a century long. When the coffin was already being lowered into the ground, I suddenly caught myself thinking that I had never truly forgiven her, and felt not pain, but an empty, almost professorial sense of righteousness. Mary lay in a dark suit she had sewn herself. I knew every seam on it. I knew them because I had once reproached her for crooked stitches, for a carelessly hidden thread, for an ink-stained sleeve. The ink was mine, as were most of the marks on her life. I am 79. I am a professor of ethics at the University of New Haven. For 40 years, I told young people about forgiveness as the highest form of strength. They applauded, quoted me in their theses, noted our ideal union with Mary in anniversary posts. We were a facade, restrained, glossy, without cracks. I kept her beside me, reminding her how much she owed me. It began with a letter, old, folded in 4, with a coffee stain in the margin. I found it by accident. It fell out of her sewing box, between chalk and spools of thread. The letter contained a few lines from some Adam, a photographer from Milan, about a night that changes fate and the courage to break free. I remember standing in our small apartment in Chicago, holding the paper and feeling not so much jealousy as humiliation. She betrayed me once, briefly, foolishly. She returned that same evening and told me everything herself, before I could even ask a question. She cried, said it was a mistake, that she was afraid of losing herself beside me, my ambitions, my plans for the department. I could have left. I could have broken a plate, slammed the door, made a scene, as normal, living people do. But even then I was too rational. I sat down opposite her, placed the letter on the table and said calmly, "I am giving you a second chance." She looked at me as if I had just saved her from execution. In that moment, I first tasted the flavor of power disguised as mercy. It was subtler than revenge and more durable than anger. I understood. Her guilt was a thread with which one could stitch our entire shared life. From then on, I did not shout. I did not reproach her directly. I simply remembered. When she wanted to open her own workshop in Boston, I gently remarked, "After what happened, we need stability." When she stayed late at work, I looked at the clock a little longer than necessary, and in the air hung a phrase I did not utter. I became the keeper of her guilt. The university published our photos from charity evenings. "An example of trust and devotion," they wrote under the pictures. I stood beside her, upright, impeccable, with that same silver pen in the pocket of my jacket. She sewed my suits, adjusted the collars, wiped away the ink stains I left when I hurried to lectures. Once I spilled ink directly onto her new white blouse. She only said quietly, "It's all right, I'll fix it." She always fixed the fabric, and I did not. Now, standing by her grave, I understand, I chose not love, but control, not forgiveness, but lifelong superiority. I preserved the marriage because it looked good in photographs, because colleagues valued my steadfastness, because on social media it is easier to show a golden anniversary than to admit one's own pettiness. I did not leave her then, not because of love. I stayed so that she would remember. And now, when she can no longer owe me anything, for the first time, I feel that I am left alone with my impeccable reputation and with a prayer book in which there was never a page about how to ask for forgiveness oneself. After that letter, I learned to speak in a way that left no traces. I did not utter the word betrayal. It was too crude for my lexicon. I called it a mistake of youth. I never raised my voice. I simply created an atmosphere in which Mary breathed more carefully than a seamstress working with the most expensive silk. We moved to New Haven when I received a permanent position at the university. My office, with its dark bookcases, quickly became the place where articles on moral responsibility and the social contract were born. I wrote about the second chance as the foundation of civilization, about mercy as an act of strength. Students looked at me with admiration. Mary looked with gratitude. It was my favorite currency. "You remember," I would say when she suggested going to Italy for a week with her designer friend, "we shouldn't risk our stability." The word risk hung between us like an old ghost. She nodded. She always nodded. When our son Thomas was born, I felt I had gained an additional argument. "A family needs an example," I repeated. We had to look whole, unshakable. I forbade myself even to imagine that someone might one day learn about that old letter. It was important to me that colleagues, students, neighbors see us as a model. Mary began sewing at home, at first for acquaintances, then for a small boutique downtown. She had taste, a delicate sense of line. She could make something alive out of plain canvas. "Maybe I should open my own studio," she said cautiously once. I put down the newspaper. "After everything we've been through, we need calm, Mary. You understand?" She understood. I did not forbid. I reminded. Years passed. We celebrated anniversaries in restaurants overlooking the river, took photographs for the university's Facebook. Caption, 40 years of unwavering partnership. People liked them, wrote, "What a beautiful couple." I felt a warm pride blooming inside me, not for love, but for a well-maintained image. In the private space of our home, I remained the keeper of balance. When Mary argued with me, rarely but it happened, I did not enter into conflict. I simply said quietly, "I didn't leave then. It was a formula, a key, a lock." After those words, she changed. Her shoulders dropped. Her voice became softer. "I know, and I'm grateful," she would say. Grateful. I taught her gratitude as carefully as she learned to sew the perfect hidden stitch. At times, I caught myself beginning to forget what she had been like before that story. Lively, daring, brave. Now she moved carefully, as if afraid to touch something fragile again. I convinced myself that this was maturity. One evening, I returned from a lecture earlier and found her at work. On the table lay a dress made of thin white fabric. On the sleeve, a dark ink stain. "What is this?" I asked. She smiled awkwardly. "Your pen leaked in your jacket pocket again." I didn't notice. She said it as if apologizing for my mistake. I watched her trying to remove the stain, and suddenly it flashed through my mind. In the same way she had tried to remove that long-ago night from our life. Carefully, patiently, for years. I did not allow the fabric to be fully cleaned. Each of my "I gave you a chance" was another stroke of ink. I convinced myself that I was maintaining order, that I was holding the moral framework of the family, that without my firmness, everything might fall apart. In truth, I feared something else. If I truly forgave, We would become equal, and I had already grown accustomed to standing a little higher. When Mary turned 70, she received an offer to exhibit her collection in a small gallery in Boston. Her eyes shone as they had many years ago in our Chicago apartment. "Will you come with me?" she asked. I thought about the schedule, about a lecture, about an important meeting with the dean, but most of all, about the fact that her success might make her less dependent on my magnanimous decision of 40 years ago. "Of course," I answered. "After what you remember we went through, I will always be by your side." It sounded like support. In truth, it was another chain, and she accepted it, as she accepted everything I offered under the guise of love. She was dying quietly, just as she had lived in recent decades. Pancreatic cancer. The doctor at St. Vincent's Hospital in New Haven spoke dryly, almost academically. I listened to him as if it were another lecture, with a clear structure, with forecasts, with survival percentages. Mary looked out the hospital window, where autumn leaves yellowed behind the glass, and remained silent. I sat by her bed with that same prayer book in my hands. The nurses said I was a model husband. I brought fresh flowers every day, read psalms aloud to her, signed all the documents without hesitation. The facade held until the end. One evening, when only the two of us remained in the room, she unexpectedly took my hand. Her fingers were light, almost transparent. "David," she said quietly, "did you ever truly forgive me?" I felt something tighten inside, not from pain, but from irritation. Even now she returns to this? "Mary," I answered with my usual calm dignity, "I stayed with you. I lived my whole life with you. Isn't that an answer?" She looked at me for a long time. There was no accusation in her gaze, only fatigue. "That was your answer," she whispered, "but not mine. I did not understand then, or did not want to understand." In the final weeks, she barely spoke. Only once did she ask me to bring her old box of threads from home. I was surprised, but I fulfilled the request. She ran her fingers over the spools as if counting years. At the bottom of the box lay a white shirt, mine, from the Chicago days. On the cuff, a barely noticeable dark stain, ink, mine. "I never managed to remove it completely," she said with a faint smile. "Some things don't disappear. You simply learn to wear them." I nodded, not knowing what to answer. On the day of her death, I held her hand and felt a strange, cold sense of justice, as if an account kept for 40 years had finally been closed. She never heard from me the simple word, "Forgive me." Instead, I said, "I was always by your side." She smiled faintly and closed her eyes. After the funeral, the house became too large. Her dresses hung in the closet, perfectly ironed, silent. In my office on the wall, a photograph from our golden anniversary, caption, "50 years of loyalty." I looked at that word, loyalty, and suddenly realized that it had nothing to do with love. Colleagues sent condolences. Students wrote that they admired my endurance. The university published an obituary. Mary Collins, devoted wife of Professor David Collins, talented seamstress, an example of support. Not a word about her dream, about the Boston exhibition, about her own name. I walked through empty rooms and felt that my righteousness warmed no one. It was like a fireplace without fire. Beautiful architecture, but cold. One evening, I opened her wardrobe and pressed my face into the fabric of her coat. The scent had almost vanished, and suddenly I was pierced by a simple, unbearable thought. I won. I remained morally impeccable. I did not betray. I gave a second chance. I preserved the family. I gained society's respect. And now there is no one left to remind of this debt. I sat in her workshop, at the table where she had for years corrected my traces, and for the first time allowed myself to ask, what if she had long ago atoned for her guilt, not before me, but before God? And what if the only person who kept punishing was me? The prayer book lay nearby. I opened it at random. My gaze fell on the line. For judgment without mercy awaits the one who has shown no mercy. I closed the book. For the first time in 40 years, I did not know on whose side the truth was. And for the first time, I felt cold. The drawer in her desk always stuck. I knew that, but never fixed it. Mary said it was even more convenient that way. You had to make an effort to reach the most important things. I opened it after the 40th day. Among patterns, old measuring tapes, and neatly tied scraps of fabric lay an envelope. On it, her handwriting. For David. No date. The paper was thin, almost transparent. Her handwriting, even, like a stitch. David, if you are reading this, it means I can no longer say aloud what I did not have the courage for. Not because I was afraid of you, but because I was afraid of destroying the fragile thing that still existed between us. I betrayed you then, and I repented for more than 1 year. I confessed. I spoke with God. I forgave myself, not at once, but sincerely. I tried to earn your trust, not with fear, but with love. You stayed with me, and I was grateful. But over time, I realized you did not stay with me. You stayed above me. I saw how carefully you reminded, how your mercy became a wall. I accepted it because I believed that was what justice looked like. But justice without forgiveness is cold. For a long time, I asked God to teach me to live without fear of your silence. And you know, one day I woke up and realized I was no longer afraid. I simply love you as you are, even with your need to be right. What hurt me was not that you did not forgive. What hurt me was that you never allowed yourself to be weak beside me. I would have endured your anger. I would have endured your shout. But I could not warm your cold righteousness. If one day you feel loneliness, do not punish yourself. You knew how to love. You were simply afraid of losing height. And love is always at eye level. I long ago atoned for my sin before God. Before you, I could not. Because you were not seeking peace, you were seeking guarantees. Signed, Your Mary. I sat for a long time. Twilight thickened outside the window. On the table lay her old white shirt with a barely noticeable ink stain. I ran my fingers over it and suddenly understood she had never tried to remove it completely. She left it as a reminder that fabric endures more than we think. All my life I was afraid that people would learn about our crack, afraid of shame, gossip, judgment, and for the sake of an impeccable facade, I sacrificed the simplest thing, a warm word. Now all I have left is a house full of perfectly sewn things and a reputation that warms worse than ashes. I closed the drawer and pressed the letter to my chest. If it were possible to turn back time, I would tell her not about a second chance. I would say, come down with me to eye level. But now I have only one thing left, to learn to ask for forgiveness in a silence where no one will answer anymore.